Hey everybody and welcome back. In this video we are going to talk about statistic management games and their fundamentals. Before I get started, a huge thank you to my members and patrons. Your names will be running across the bottom of the screen at the end of the video. And of course a huge thank you to everybody for subscribing and hitting that notification icon. That really helps me out. So what is a statistic management game? Essentially, a statistic management game, they come in all sorts of different forms. They can be survival games, they can be little dicky RPGs, really anything that has any kind of stats, whether that be hit points or mana or food and drink in the case of survival games. That is all stuff that will appear in the statistics management game category at some level or another. Now, a statistic management game has certain rules, and primarily of those is that obviously you need a primary statistic, and it's usually something that will gradually reduce if the player doesn't do anything. For example, in survival games, it's generally the food and drink stat. If you don't actually eat or drink, eventually those stats will wear out and you will eventually suffer from some kind of negative impact. That's usually dying or having significantly reduced performance in the game. Player action will generally increase the primary statistic by a small amount, and as you progress through the game and you increase your secondary stats, you will find that increasing the primary stat becomes easier. Usually there are multiple different stats, primary and secondary. For example, your primary stats would be your hit points, and your secondary stats would be your food and drink, and your food and drink will wear down, thus impacting your hit points. However, you could also consider your food and drink to be primary stats as well, and then your ability to make better food and drink would be your secondary stats. Secondary stats, more often than not, they will affect the rate at which the player can change the primary stat. So for example, if you had a cooking skill, the higher your cooking skill, the better the food you can make, and thus the better you will be at increasing your primary stats. And I'm using food and drink as an example in this case, but it can apply to all sorts of different statistics, of course. Secondary stats often affect the rate which the player can increase other primary stats or secondary stats. So for example, if you have an intelligence stat, that could increase the XP rate that you gain from doing certain actions, and then obviously that would affect the speed that you gain all other stats. Such in the case of the Fallout series, your special stats, one of your stats will increase your XP rate, which obviously increases your ability to level up more quickly, and then that would increase your ability to gain other stats faster. Difficulty is something that is often out of balance, and it can be dependent on several factors. Firstly, how quickly the primary stat goes down. And there are a lot of survival games out there at the moment that don't have this particular factor down pat. One game that springs to mind is Raft. In Raft, your food and drink go down at such a phenomenal rate that you end up having to micromanage your food and drink to the point where the game becomes very difficult, to the point where it becomes less fun. You're constantly having to keep an eye on your food and drink stats, and when you get later in the game, you'll find yourself going through 2 or 3 sharks a day in order to keep your food stat up, and 2 or 3 full kind of canisters of water. That's just bad balance. Also, how quickly the player can increase the primary stat, and again we go back to Raft and I say how that's a bad example, because I know for a fact that if I ate a quarter of a shark, I'd be pretty damn full after that. However, in this game, if you eat a quarter of the meat that you get off the shark, you'll only get about sort of 30% of your food bar filled up. And again, I'm using food and drink as examples in this case, but this applies to any kind of primary stat that you happen to have. So having the stat go down too quickly can be a bad thing. However, having it go down too slowly can also be a bad thing, because it obviously reduces the amount of difficulty. And how quickly the player can increase the primary stat is obviously the second part of that balance formula. How many of the secondary stats there are and how much they affect the primary stat. So you'll tend to find that in survival games or RPGs, there tend to be quite a large number of different stats that you can actually build upon now, and each one will affect other stats in certain ways. For example, a lot of the stats in the Fallout series don't necessarily affect your hit points or anything like that. They have kind of secondary perks that allow you to do different things. So it's a case of having stats that don't necessarily have any impact on the primary stat, and if they have any impact on the gameplay whatsoever, or if they're just kind of badge collector stats. Any snakes that might appear during the course of the game. Now, I use the word snake when I'm referring to it in the terms of snakes and ladders, where there may be an event that happens in your game which causes a specific stat to just drop completely to zero. Maybe in a survival game you get dysentery or food poisoning, which of course will cause you to evacuate your stomach or bowels, which would obviously reduce your hydration or your food. Perhaps it's a dating sim and you do something monumentally stupid which causes your affection stat with one particular character to drop down to zero rapidly. And these are, they're interesting in terms of gameplay mechanics. They're fun to add, but at the same time, if you have too many of them, the player will lose interest, and that will bring us on to that. We'll cover that in the next part of this. Having more than one primary stat can obviously also increase the difficulty dependent on whether it's a stat that goes up or down. Now, in the case of the food or drink, generally speaking, your hit points won't just gradually decrease. They will stay fine until your food and drink stats will reduce to zero, at which point then you start losing hit points. So having more than one primary stat can be a good thing, but it can also again be a bad thing in terms of difficulty balance. Now, we're talking about playability. What we need to do is make sure that there's balance between difficulty and enjoyment, and we can do that by allowing the player to feel like they're progressing. And this can be a completely artificial progression, but the player has to feel like they're moving forward in the game in some way, shape or form. There also must be consequences for making mistakes. They need to be severe enough to make the player not want to make the mistakes, but not so severe that the game becomes unrecoverable, unless the mistake is so bad that it actually causes the player's character to die. And this is again something that a lot of survival games don't do very well. You'll be playing through a survival game, you'll make a mistake right at the beginning, but the consequences for that mistake won't manifest for several in-game days, which could be 2 or 3 hours of playtime. So you make that mistake, you don't realize you've made a mistake, you can't recover from it, but you waste 2 or 3 hours playing anyway, only to die. And there are several games, for example Green Hell, that do this really badly, where you make a mistake early on and you end up dying. It leads to your it's not even a steady decline, it's just a rapid decline in your character's well-being. And so you can waste 2 or 3 hours trying to recover from it, and in reality it's just not possible. Grinding is good with moderation, so having the player repeat tasks over and over again to increase stats is okay, as long as that is not the main mechanic of the game. So even I've been guilty of this in previous titles that I've written, in that sometimes you just put a little bit too much grinding in there and you end up getting people just lose interest and they switch off. Now, this is where having a little bit of realism can help, because if you put grinding in your game, somebody is going to complain. That is a fact. There is always going to be someone who complains that there's too much grinding because they want all of the reward with no effort, and that is just bad planning. You need to have a game that is there's sufficient grinding to get a reward, but not so much that it pushes people past, and that's a very fine balance that a lot of developers struggle with. In fact, games like World of Warcraft are a prime example of this, where back in the day when World of Warcraft first came out, the grind was good because the rewards were spread out sufficiently throughout the levels that you were always going to get a reward, whether that's, for example, changing into plate armor when you've been wearing mail all along, or getting a mount. And those things were staggered throughout the level range so that you would get a decent reward every few levels for grinding. Whereas now, obviously, they've in order to appease players who maybe want a little bit more instant gratification, they've just given you all the rewards at the start and cut the grind out, or at least severely reduced the grind. Whereas, back in the day, getting to level 40 would take you months. Nowadays, you can get to level 120 odd in a matter of hours. So achievements is another good thing that you can add to playability. I don't mean Steam achievements or anything like that. I mean achievements within the game. So having cutscenes, having some way of letting the player know that they are making progress and that they've accomplished something. That's a really good tool for giving your game a little bit more of an edge. And of course, making sure that the rewards reflect the amount of effort they took to get there. So having the player grind for hours and hours and hours to get a stat up, only to make it a complete anticlimax by only allowing them to do one very boring thing, that's another potential recipe for disaster. What you really want is your rewards to be balanced and the player to feel like it was worth the grind, more importantly. Nothing will kill your player base or make them bored faster than grinding for hours to get something that's completely mundane and uninteresting. Well, thanks very much for watching that, guys. I hope you found that useful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Always keen to hear what you think. And I will see you in the next video. Until then, take care of yourselves, guys. Bye-bye.